Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Holly Smithson. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Athena, and we are about to turn this 2 o'clock hour on its head. Anybody ready for that? First of all, I just want to acknowledge Sarah and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this week's conference. Previously, I worked at the California Life Sciences Association and have long worked with the DeviceTalks folks and Sarah and her team. So delighted to come back in my new capacity as the CEO of Athena. And for those of you that don't know, that aren't familiar with Athena, we are a premier women's empowerment advocate. We exclusively focus on women working in the STEM workforce. We've been at this for 20 years, 2 decades. And you can imagine our surprise that there are many out there in the marketplace that are calling 2018 and more importantly into the second decade, the decade of the woman. Athena is really positioned to lead this national dialogue, and we're really excited to really test the strategies of companies, large and small, and academic institutions and enterprises around their gender equality strategy. All right, so to give you a little bit of background on Athena, again, we're celebrating our 20-year anniversary. For the last couple of decades, we have been empowering our member community through instruments for change. And those instruments come in the form of our professional development and our executive leadership programming. Those instruments for change come in the form of community investment. We put about $500,000 into scholarship funds for girls that are pursuing degrees in STEM. And then the last instrument for change is in the market research. And the market research pillar is what I'm going to share with all of you this afternoon. Okay, so the agenda is going to fall into 3 buckets. Number 1, we're going to set the stage and talk about the existing state of affairs around gender equality in the STEM workforce. The second item, we're going to be talking about some of the challenges, large and small, and some of the really, really prime opportunities that are prime for upping. And then we're going to talk about some of the recommendations and some of the ways that we can solve for these problems. So at the beginning of 2018, I'm sure a lot of you recall the #MeToo campaign. There was just a litany of issues and articles and coverage around gender equality, talking about sexual harassment, gender discrimination. And so we at Athena decided we really needed to go out and drive the national dialogue with data. And so what we did is we took out a partnership with UC San Diego, I think this thing is moving here quicker than I'm talking, which is rare. Basically went out and conducted an index and said, where are we? Over the last 25 years, how many women have been working in the STEM workforce? What is the representation? And what we found is that 75% of all the STEM jobs are held by men. That's not a good ratio. But let's take this down and drive in sector by sector. All right, so here is the representation of women working in the STEM workforce. We've got it drilled down by sector. In the life science sector, you'll see the gold bar or the yellow bar shows that over the last 25 years, we've seen the number of women represented in the life science sector double, more than double. If we look at the tech sector, we see that the representation of women has actually cut in half. So that represents a 50% exit rate for women working in tech. If we look at engineers, the women represented in that field have basically leveled over the last 25 years at, I believe, 11%. And then on management, we know that women have been represented in the STEM leadership positions or the C-suite, and that also has remained flat at 20%. Now, this is an interesting slide that I want to share with you because there's been a lot of talk out in the marketplace, and I want to really debunk this myth because what we hear a lot of times is that, you know what, we really want to employ more women in the STEM workforce. We really want to engage the power and the diversity of women into our STEM economy. But you know what, Holly? The pipeline just isn't robust enough. The talent pipeline isn't there to support the workforce demands that we have today. And to this, I say, you know what? You need to face the data. And the data tells us as of 2016, more than 40% of the PhDs and more than 40% of the undergrad degrees in STEM are held by women. It's a stunning data point that somehow gets lost in the political and the public discourse around women and gender equality. Now, this is an interesting slide too, because if you'll recall on the last slide, we talked about the number of women being represented in the life science sector, which of course includes the medical device industry. That number has doubled, right? And in the tech sector, the number has cut in half. So now if we look at holistically, this is the total number of jobs. Did I lose this? Yep. This is the total number of STEM jobs in the United States as of 2016. Half of the STEM jobs are found in the tech sector. And a third of those jobs are represented in engineering. But yet those are the flattest numbers of women that are represented in the most amount of jobs in the STEM economy. Those are very, very paltry and unacceptable numbers. So now let's move away from the quantitative data and let's walk through the qualitative data. Anybody recognize this name on the screen? So this gentleman, and I won't go over the quote, but he basically says the reason why gender inequality exists today is because women, at our biological core, we are just naturally gregarious. We are naturally agreeable. And for those traits, because of those biological traits, we are unable to speak, we are unable to ask for raises, we are unable to negotiate our salaries, and we are in a position not to lead. Pretty stunning rationale from one of the largest tech companies and employers in the world. And by the way, this gentleman is unemployed. The next qualitative data point I wanted to share with you is the CEO of Salesforce. Obviously notable for being the tech mad genius that he is. And a couple of years ago, he went on TV and basically said they have pay parity at Salesforce. And they absolutely respect the women and what they contribute to Salesforce, when in fact, his communications officer said, boss, I'm sorry, we actually don't have pay parity. And he actually, to his credit, did a course correction to the tune of about $6 million and made sure that all the women in the same positions as their male counterpart were then brought up to have pay parity. But the point in this slide isn't that this gentleman didn't really know that there are disparities in his own workforce. The beauty of this slide, certainly with Mark Benioff, is that there's a perception gap out there. And we honestly believe, we have these belief systems based on what we know to be true. And part of this journey towards gender equality is actually challenging our belief systems and putting data and facing that data. Because when we do that, we can start to raise awareness and start to do the course correction that Mark Benioff did last year.
Do you think it's a pipeline problem? Because some would say, well, you're not looking hard enough.
Oh, we look very hard. In fact, we just hired a young woman from Stanford who's every bit as good as her peers, and if there are more like her, we'll hire them. What we're not prepared to do is to lower our standards.
So, as you can imagine, it's a pretty sobering revelation for those in Silicon Valley and for all of the women that really felt like in order to be a part of any tech company or any STEM company that they were in essence lowering their standards. This is nothing new to tech, to Silicon Valley. It's just that through all of the social media and through all these various media channels that the awareness is really, really growing at a rapid pace.
Women and men participated equally, the world economy could gain $28 trillion by 2025. The research is clear. Gender equality is an enormous opportunity for businesses to improve their own performance. Companies with at least one woman in senior management tend to see significantly higher annual performance. By By closing gender gaps, companies benefit through increased productivity and higher retention. Investors are increasingly looking at the gender equality performance of companies as an indicator for potential growth. Beyond advancing gender equality and women's empowerment internally, companies can impact all areas of society and be a leader in creating lasting, positive change. Despite this opportunity, many social, economic, and legal barriers for women still exist, preventing them from entering the workforce, progressing in their careers, and growing their businesses. In fact, at the
So this is a very interesting production that McKinsey produced last year, and it basically disavowed everything that you heard on the preceding slides in terms of the qualitative data that is out there that states when there are women in the workforce, when there are women in the boardroom, when there are women that are leading these companies, there are greater profits that are being realized. There is an increased productivity across the talent population. There is an increase in the innovation cycle. And so for companies that actually have to be held accountable to their customers, for companies that have to be accountable to their shareholders, this data shows that there's a fiduciary responsibility to actually identify and implement a gender equality strategy. And to do otherwise is to really be leaving money on the table. And so although these data points paint a very, very paltry picture, and I'm sorry to depress you with these numbers, but we're actually excited about the data because it just gives us a level of awareness. It gives us a starting point. It gives us an index. And so I think that in this national dialogue that we're having in America, and I would argue around the world, that we now come from a position of data. And we're now in a position to start to see how big the gap is, understand what is the root cause of this gap, and then to help understand what are the intervention strategies that companies can put in place in order to close that gap, in order to increase the profitability, in order to increase the innovation, and in order to really dominate in the war for talent, and to help dominate in the world for customers, and dominate in the world of social impact. Because I submit, when we put in a gender equality strategy in all of our companies, the startup companies who raised your hands earlier, the larger companies who are on this stage, and the academic folks that are in the room, gender equality becomes your company's superpower. And in a world that is so markedly competitive for talent, everyone's looking for a very distinct market differentiator. And so with all of the looming data, I do want to tell you that the bright spot is on either one of these slides, and it is represented in the UN, the United Nations Global Compact. And what the UNGC is, it's the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative. And it launched in 2015. It was really the brainchild of the late Kofi Annan. He was the UN Secretary General. And he basically said, we need to create this body of evidence, this body of research to really put a personal face on the business community. And so he set up this UN Global Compact, which is essentially a toolkit. If we can really distill it down, it's a toolkit and a set of best practices. And one of those best practices is around gender equality. And so what they aptly call this is called Agenda 2030. So it is qualitative, it is time-bound, and it is qualitative in nature, and it sets forth some very clear best practices for companies that commit to sign in to the Sustainable Development Goals, and then it has a time horizon of achieving and implementing these goals by 2030. And then it has an annual reporting, so all of those companies that actually sign on to the Agenda 2030, they then report in every year and actually report how they are succeeding in terms of implementing these goals. So this is an exciting platform. It is so big. And what's unique about this initiative is that when we think about the United Nations, I mean, they're a member-based organization just like Athena, right? Except for their members are the 193 countries that make up the world. And so what the UN saw as a real opportunity to bring this Agenda 2030 a reality is it needs to partner with folks that actually can bring businesses to the table. We can have this great toolkit, but if we actually don't have the businesses, we're not engaging the business community and giving them the wherewithal in order to change or to close the gender gap, then it's just a great idea that sits unrealized. And so that's where Athena comes in, and that's why we are so excited to partner with the UN and bring in our STEM community, because we believe that the STEM jobs and the STEM companies and the STEM innovation represent the greatest wealth creation, and they also represent the greatest platform to impact and drive society. So when we think about the UN Global Compact, we know that the #1 essential driver in that success is the engagement of the private sector. So let's see how we're doing. So 2015 was only 1,000 days ago. It's really frightening when we break it down to days. But in 1,000 days, the United Nations has been able to onboard almost 10,000 companies from around 160 countries that are participating and committed to this, and Athena is one of those signatories. It is an exciting opportunity. It gives people the power and the toolkits to effectuate change. One of the things that we learn is that there are a lot of companies that understand this and see this as an economic imperative, but they just don't know how. And so again, this toolkit gives them the resources. So as we look to the resolution about how do we close this gap, here's the argument that we submitted to the UN and said, you know what, Athena, for 20 years we have been convening the STEM community. We have been empowering the top leaders within these STEM companies to ensure that they could navigate the biases, that they could educate themselves in ways that enable them to rise within an otherwise male-dominated industry. And we basically said, we, for 20 years, have been that guide dog for the STEM companies. And so we want to take that relationship, we want to leverage our platform, and we want to help these companies close the gender gap. And so that, in essence, is the beauty behind this partnership with Athena, who is a Southern California-based organization, and we are excited about locking arms with the UN Global Compact and their USA network to bring these tools to you, to all of you in this room, and to those. And I would argue this is a global STEM hub in California. If we can crack this nut in California, and oh, by the way, all of these STEM companies that are housed here in California, all of us have supply chain, and we have talent that cascades across the country, across the globe, rather. So if we look at the supply chain and we look at the labor that we employ in third world and developing countries, you start to see the cascading effect of how this can actually move the needle and address the global implications that the McKinsey video just highlighted. And so that's the nexus that the United Nations understands. That's the power and the ability to effectuate change at that magnitude and at that order. And so I don't want anybody in this room to think that this is a California initiative or this is a Southern California initiative. This is a global opportunity. And that's why everyone in this room should be excited about this. So one of the other opportunities for Athena, obviously, to exercise our convening power. We're excited about bringing in the life science companies into this discussion. We're excited about bringing the tech companies. But ultimately, what's going to drive the success of this global compact is the ability to bring transparency and accountability. And so, as I shared with you earlier in the presentation, we have this Athena Workforce Equity Index. And so what we want to do is every 2 years, biennially, we want to come back to the industry. We want to capture the success rates of these companies that are implementing these best practices around gender equality. And then we want to feature some case studies. Because listen, I'm not here to tell you that this is going to be a silver bullet. It's not. This is a very complex issue. And in the same way that we start a new product. We've got a new product launch. And in the same way that we want to exploit a new market, or if we want to start up a new company, there is no silver bullet. It is a very complex and very nuanced endeavor. And so closing the gender gap is going to be equally complex. So that's why the accountability and the transparency is going to be pivotal. And what we're going to do as part of this Athena Index is we're also going to uncover what the business rewards are, but also talk about the business risks. And at the end game, this is all about the risk and the reward ratio. And so that's why we're excited about driving this national dialogue about bringing these global resources and ultimately driving lasting change. So here's just a sort of a pictorial representation of all the different players in order to ultimately bring gender equality into the world that we know. So if I seem a little excited on this December afternoon, it's really because we came off of Athena just hosted an event with the United Nations Global Compact and their USA network just last week, Thursday and Friday up in San Francisco. What they do, their USA network, they basically host events around the country and bring in companies to talk about the risks and the rewards that they're experiencing as they implement these best practices. So it's a very candid conversation. It's at the highest levels. They're all C-levels that have KPIs attached to these gender equality initiatives. And then understand where are the biggest, what are the bigger speed bumps as these companies attempt to implement the gender equality. We were excited about this initiative. Obviously, there's a great deal of life science and tech companies that are up in the Bay Area, and there were some really great case studies. And one of the case studies, we had the CEO of Athleta, and she took to the stage and talked about her experience as the CEO of a company. This is a women's apparel company, for those of you that don't know Athleta. It's a subsidiary of Gap. And she got up there and she went on the stage and she said, you know what, I've been here for 20 years. I left, I started in obviously at entry level, and then I left for 7 years and I went to go bear children. I came back to Athleta, and I can tell you in my whole experience, I've never felt any discrimination. I've never felt any gender bias. But I have to be careful that my own personal experience doesn't become my belief system that I then believe is universally the case for everyone else. And that really resonated with me, for this woman to get up there and say, I'm with a company that really gets it. And I have to make sure that I'm not blind to the gender inequalities that are out there. This again speaks to the perception gap. In this journey, the first step in this journey is to have the awareness that there are gender inequalities. And if you in your own position, like Mark Benioff, who didn't believe that there was pay disparity, and so he just universally assumed that meant for his entire company, if we don't understand the perception gap and we believe that our own experience must be universally true, then it's going to be a longer journey than any of us will probably live to see. And so that was a really powerful nugget for me, and I want to share that with this group and really ask you to challenge your own perceptions about what you see in your companies, and challenge your own belief systems about, yeah, that doesn't really happen in our company. We're good. We actually have one woman in the C-spot or the C-suite. We actually have somebody that's getting paid equally across our enterprise. Really challenge that, because that will be the key to the success as we take this journey. These are just some great photos from an otherwise action-packed UN Athena event. And so I'm just going to wrap up my presentation and invite comments or questions from the group and leave you with this challenge. Are you ready? And I would submit that it's going to take more than just the CEO. It's going to take more than just a bolt-on. It's got to be a core strategic value in these companies. Anybody interested? Happy to take any comments, questions?
Is the audio working perfect?
That was a good presentation. Ken Michike, I'm actually located in Boston. One of the questions I'd have on the data with the 40% of degrees is what percentage of those women are actually staying in the U.S. after they're degreed for a STEM position, meaning domestic versus an international student. And then we've actually been having some communications in Boston with some different groups around this subject matter. One of the things we came up with is, with career pathing or even exposure to careers, when you look at our public school system, unless you're in a STEM school, they're never even seeing any of this. And we're trying to come up with some strategies where it would be built into the curriculum much, much earlier on. My kids went to a high school that's public, and they were exposed to life sciences and pharma. Some of it was funded by MassBio and Thermo and some other companies where they're actually building labs and getting them exposed to equipment earlier on, and then they're actually going in and doing like a job shadow or getting to see what goes on in pharma or biotech or life science, whatever it is, so that they can determine, is this something I might be interested in? So in some ways, yeah, it's a societal challenge, but based on how the economy is changing, it's a failure of the educational system too, because we're just teaching kids the way we've always taught them. So that would be almost a number one for me, is you start building it into the curriculum.
Yep. And there's a lot of activity going around, not only the STEM focus, but now it's expanding to STEAM, right? So Athena obviously works on the latter end of the pipeline. There are multiple organizations. Actually, one of the ones we partner with is called Sally Ride, the late Sally Ride, set up at UC San Diego. They won the bid for it, and they basically host programs to expose children very early on in the middle age, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and actually take on projects related to STEM and get them excited and actually envision themselves as doing this for a living. There's a multitude of initiatives that are happening in the media. I was in New York at the UN General Assembly this summer, or in September, Gina Davis, and she talked about how so many women actually would see like NCIS, or they would see one of these programs where they see the girl who's a geeky scientist and says, oh, well then I can do that. Or they would see the impression of the woman as a scientist as something that's glorified. Whereas in some media, they would have that person somehow blow up or not get a family or not be positioned for success. So you have all these different factors and influences that help shape the minds of these girls that are considering, do I go left, do I go right? And so there's a lot of forces coming at this to try to help shape an environment that encourages and entices these young girls. When I think about what we can do, recognizing that, let's say we've done all that, let's say that the curriculum is actually encouraging and inviting young girls to imagine themselves being a scientist or a technologist and an engineer. Let's say all of that happens. Then they get into the companies and they actually get paid 20 cents, 80 cents to the dollar. Let's say they actually break through, get the degrees, get the job, and let's say they actually don't have flexibility policies and they have a family, so they have to then pick one over the other. Let's say they actually get through the curriculum and they get the degree and they get the job, but then they find out that they're actually not getting promoted because of their gender, or because they're not getting recognized and treated in a way that honors and respects their diversity. So those are key elements to, and these are all captured in the best practices, by the way. So when we talked about our recruiting, the biases that we have in recruiting, the biases that we have just in the way that we write the job description. The way in which we are interviewed, women being interviewed, I mean, all of these things, and again, it hasn't been my experience. If it has, I was oblivious to it. But it doesn't mean that it's not out there. And the more and more research that is out there, it shows all of these hindrances that lead to the statistics that we saw earlier in the presentation. So while I absolutely spot on agree with you about having to have this at a deeper level within the curriculum, we also have to make sure once we finally get them and they've gotten on the diving board and they're ready to jump in the deep end, we have to make sure it's an inviting experience rather than saying, I'm getting paid less, I'm not getting promoted, I'm not being recognized, I'm being interrupted, I'm being harassed, I don't have flexibility to care for my children, I don't have the flexibility to care for my elderly parents. You know what? I'm going to take my PhD, I'm going to take my genius, and I'm going to go do something different. And society, and ultimately society loses, as we saw in the longer McKinsey report. So it's a big issue, and again, I don't want to be Debbie Downer up here. I think it's empowering when we have the data. I mean, think about, the gentleman up here, Shane, was talking about open innovation. I mean, it's what we do in California, and sometimes in Boston. We have this open innovation. I mean, you talk about the organic innovation, you talk about the open source innovation. We are so innovative. If we can't crack this nut, if we can't do this knowing our own disposition to disrupt markets, disrupt technology, then I would say we just don't have the data, and I would argue we're just not facing the data. And so I'll leave you with that challenge because I could go on and on. Obviously, I'm very passionate about this issue, and I'm really excited because people are paying attention, they care, and the data supports it. And now we're challenging, now we get to challenge people and say, you're leaving money on the table. Now you're going to get the attention of shareholders. And those shareholders, they're customers. Now you're going to be talking about losing market share. Now you're going to talk about losing serious revenue streams. And that's why it's exciting, because everybody's vested. Everybody has something to gain here, and everybody has something to lose. Yes.
I think your presentation was excellent. I happen to have several sisters and a daughter, and they're all doing well. But I'm sure they encountered what you're suggesting here. And unfortunately, societal changes in the United States sometimes just take time. They affect other groups as well, not just women, and I can speak to that, but I'm not going to. What I wanted to know was, to what extent have you taken this talk to universities, and maybe this was already touched on. If it was, I apologize, but I think it would be good to take it to universities, not only name universities, but others, because I think it has such a very strong message to it. I happen to be a coach at the UCI Center for Innovation,
Yep.
and yesterday there were 3 companies that I analyzed where they pitched, and every one of them had women on the team. Mm-hmm. And so I see quite a significant change over the last few years, which I'm very excited about. But leave that with a question for you. I think that the university setting across the U.S. would be quite a thing to do, and let's get a huge wave going.
Thank you for your comment. And I will say the university, that sector, the academic sector, suffers dramatically. I'm seeing a lot of heads nodding in the room. Certainly in the research institutes, there's been a lot of litigation around sexual harassment, sexual discrimination, most notably Salk Institute. So, we like to think that there's certain sectors that we're special, that we're really keeping women out in the legal profession or in academic profession, and everybody thinks their sector is worse off than the others. Obviously, the data shows that tech sector certainly is the case there, but honestly, it's so pervasive. And so I do respect your recommendation. Athena actually spun out of UC San Diego, as have so many of the industry cluster groups in Southern California. And so I think it's a great sort of ring the bell, if you will. One of the other sponsors at our guest at our UN Athena reception last week was the head of global sustainability at NASDAQ. And the new CEO of NASDAQ and New York Stock Exchange within the last couple of years are both women. And you can imagine how exciting it is to have the two powerhouse investment houses be run by women. One of the CEOs said, yeah, I came in, she'd been an intern, by the way. She started as an intern and spent 20 years at NASDAQ. And then she went into the restroom and it was a hall closet. And she went into the men's room and there was an attendant, there were some nice leather couches, just a completely different experience from how things used to be and how things are going to be. So I'm excited, and I really, really am optimistic because we actually now have the means. We now have the wherewithal. I believe we have the timing. I think it is right. I think the world is ready for this. I think the millennials and how they impose their social impact prerequisites for where they go to work and how long they're going to stay there, they're really redefining the way in which we recruit talent and how we keep talent and how we disrupt ourselves. So I hope all of you leave this room with just one feeling, and that is it's wide open. It really is wide open. And there have been some cynics that said, oh, well, I remember back in 1991 during the Supreme Court Justice, when that whole charade took place, and they too said in 1991 that it was the year of the woman. And I would submit, given all that we know in 2018 with how many women, even though the numbers are not where they should be, there's progression. And so I don't mean to be, Pollyanna up here, but I really, really believe that this is our time, and I really believe that we are entering the decade of the woman. And so I would want to invite all of you to be diversity champions, because it's going to be the next emerging industry.
Well, we've got time for one more question.
Yes.
We're going to go with him.
Okay. Hi, yes. Kind of a quick two-part question. One is a younger guy in business. A lot of my friends are women and doing well, and they're in great roles. Do you see this as a generational thing where maybe it's not something that'll happen overnight, but 10 years from now, it will not be uncommon at all to see women in positions of C-suite or authority? And then also, what does success look like for your organization?
So I do believe that it is, I'm going to quote, I don't know if anybody saw that documentary on CNN on Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Anybody see that last month? It was amazing. And so she talked about how her approach to getting gender diversity, I guess it was a client of hers, his wife had died when giving birth to their firstborn. And so through the Social Security benefits, he was denied benefits because he was a man, and the statute only afforded for the woman. And so Ruth Bader Ginsburg went to the Supreme Court and said, I'm going to crack this nut in a very methodical and a very patient approach. So she went to that full court of all men and said, there is gender discrimination, and in this case, for the man. And a man should be afforded the same rights as a woman, and this statute doesn't apply for that. And so she moved. You could see these men who were in their 80s and 90s. And generally, we don't think of when I'm 80 or 90, I'm probably not going to change my worldview. And was able to move the Supreme Court justice and obviously became one of the justices. But the point is, and in her documentary, it's like we've got to take implemental changes that will be in order for them to be enduring. And so I want to take a page from the Ruth Bader Ginsburg playbook and be really thoughtful about how we do this. And to your point, it has to come with accountability, and it has to come with transparency. And that's why the Athena Index is going to be so critical to measure, to track, and to report. And just to give you a scoreboard, again, this is the UN, so its customer base is global in nature. Of those 10,000 signatories around the world in the 163 countries, only 500 of those signatories resides in the U.S. So that means we're behind. That means that the appetite for companies to sign on and implement these best practices, we have companies, the majority of those signatories of the UN Global Compact are in Europe and they're in South America. Those are progressive markets of the world that have signed on and are implementing and are also enjoying the business rewards that come with gender diversity. So we're behind. We have a long way to go. And to your point, how long is this going to take, and how far do we have to come from behind? So we have a ways to go. Yes.
I'm right here, right here. We've got time for one more quick one.
You mentioned you've been in business for 20 years. I haven't heard of you, but my question is, what exactly have you done to promote engineering to women or to high schools, to lower grade classes, to colleges? And can you comment on that?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. So Athena, and I didn't go into the history too much because I wanted to spend more time on the data, but Athena was launched 20 years ago by a group of great business minds. Our mayor, Barbara Bree, city council member Barbara Bree, former Congresswoman Lynn Shank, and a number of other business leaders in Southern California. And it was basically predicated on this notion that men have a tremendous good old boy network. They support each other. They're there for each other. They're sponsoring one another. They're suggesting that Bob should be in the queue for that promotion. They're requesting that Ted should be the one to start up this new product. And so what prompted these women to launch Athena said, you know what? When women actually do defy the odds and they get there, they don't have a platform. They don't have a support network. So we need to do a better job to create that platform. And so that was really the genesis of Athena. It has evolved over 20 years, obviously, and now we open it up not just to executive women, but we open it up to all professional women. So it is a very focused mission, and it does not focus on the curriculum, the education, and the pipeline, but rather on the professional women, and that's just our distinct model.
Yeah, because I am the president of Silicon Valley Engineering Council, and we have a program, it's called Discover E, which means Discover Engineering. Mm-hmm. We involve from any grade, from small children to universities. We teach them engineering skills for free. We provide them scholarships for free, college students as well as high school students, and the women and other guys also that are deserving engineers in industry. We provide Hall of Fame. I have never heard from you, and I didn't hear from you anything what have you given to schools or to engineering, the women engineers that are there in a field of engineering, to high school students. Have you ever, your society, have you ever paid a scholarship for a deserving woman in engineering who needs a helping hand financially, but she has the brain? Yes. What have you done for the young children who are interested in engineering and they try to work on robotics? By the way, I also serve as one of the judges in a robotics competition, in synopsis competition, first robotics, etc. So just collecting data, I don't think is enough, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. I also own a company. I'm founder, CEO, and president of my company. It's called Helmand Engineering. I have a program which I provide for free to children of all ages, boys and girls. I teach them how to build hardware, and I teach them how to write software and write apps to program that hardware. They take the hardware gadget with them as a gift. So that kind of thing, I never heard you have done anything. So in order to promote engineering, you must do something, actions, not just words, so that from all ages, from the young ages to all along, including to women in field, to create the equality all along the way, so that you grow up with the sense that I am equal from the day one. And so I really need to see some facts going forward. And in regards to United Nations, I also am part of United Nations. I also speak at United Nations. And even yesterday we were invited there. So my thinking is that all the companies, including yours, We have enough data, and data we know is important, but
Yes.
actions are sometimes more important than words.
Yes.
Thank you.
I couldn't agree with you more. Thank you very much for all that you're doing. I really respect that. And we need more people to challenge society, which is what I heard you say, that society needs to do more, and everybody has a role to play. I will, just to wrap up, we've got about 100 girls that we spend about $500,000 in. We have a foundation, and we award those to women that are pursuing degrees, young girls that are pursuing degrees in engineering and the like. It's one of the activities that we take tremendous pride in, and it reminds us every year at our big annual awards ceremony when we see the champions and the companies and the women that have defied the odds, and then you see these amazing girls that are so articulate, and they already have I don't know how many patents, and they're already ready to cure diseases, and it's just amazing because ultimately that's what we're all here for, right, is the youth and the next generation. So I respect your comments. I respect your passion, and I want to share the journey with you as well.
Thanks, everyone. How about a hand for Holly?
Thank you.